CBS invites you to share in a...
This is a CBS News special report. Dan Rather at CBS News World Headquarters in New York. Good evening. We are on the air because the United States Supreme Court has reached a decision in the case of Bush versus Gore. They are remanding the case back to Florida. Now, the language being used is reversed and remanded. The Supreme Court justices have reversed and remanded the case of Gore versus Bush. Now, they sent it back to the Florida courts. Now, this is a complicated situation. What it does not do is, in effect, deliver the presidency to George Bush. It does not do that. That's one of the things it doesn't do. What it does do is it keeps alive at least the possibility of Al Gore trying to continue his contest of the certification of Bush as the winner in Florida. We turn now to Jonathan Turley. Jonathan, we don't know much about our constitutional law expert. We don't know much about this decision. They reverse and remand it to the Florida court. A 6-3 vote, unsigned. Let's do some quick analysis.
Well, what is interesting, Dan, is that they have achieved what many people thought might have been out of their reach. That is to avoid a 5-4 clearly partisan ruling. A remand means that the Supreme Court has not ended, essentially, Al Gore's legal existence in this race, that they are sending it back to the state. And the important thing here is that the Supreme Court needed to mind a line. There are certain federal questions that they may have dealt with, but any imperfections that came out of the Florida Supreme Court is really for Florida to resolve. And so what it appears to be is that the U.S. Supreme Court took this only so far, said that this opinion that you gave us, this ruling on the recount, was flawed. That's the reason we stayed it. But we're sending it back to you, and the ball is in their court. It does not mean that Al Gore will come out of this on any remand with a certain winner, far from it. But it does mean that he will live to fight another day. A remand means that they're sending this back so that corrections could be potentially made. But it will be the details as we look at this opinion as to how heavy a slope he will have to climb.
Well, repeating for those who are joining us, the United States Supreme Court has, quote, reversed and remanded the Florida State Supreme Court decision which ordered a counting, and in some cases recounting, of votes in Florida. Now, this was a long decision, we're told. Some parts are by a vote of 6-3. I underscore some parts are by a vote of 6-3. Unsigned opinion, we're told that there are two different dissents, for whatever difference that may make. But as a practical matter, one, it doesn't deliver the presidency to George Bush. Two, it gives Al Gore some, at least faint hope of getting a count or recount of those Florida ballots, but that's not assured.
Well, that's right, Dan. But for Al Gore, when he went into that argument after that 5-4 stay, which was a real shock in terms of its impact on the weekend, they were fighting really for a remand. No one really thought that there would be an affirmance of the Florida Supreme Court in the making. So Al Gore was fighting for his legal and political life, and this court seems to have extended it. A remand is what they needed so they could fight another day. And in terms of this court, we see a real fracturing here. It went this late for a reason. You had justices trying to get beyond that 5-4 vote, but you also had some justices that obviously could not sign on and had to express dissenting views. And as we look closely at this opinion, we're going to have to see what lays ahead for Al Gore. What is it that the Supreme Court will say must be done in Florida to continue?
Jonathan Turley, stick with us. We're going to go to Bob Schieffer, our chief Washington correspondent, who's standing by outside the Supreme Court. Bob, what additional light can you put on this, what only can be called another stunning decision by the United States Supreme Court?
Well, I'm still waiting, Dan, for the opinion to be brought out here. I have not seen it, but from what I can discern and from what I'm hearing from our people inside, it's the details on the remanding. What are they telling the Florida Supreme Court to do? It sounds as if they're going to have the vote restarted, but it sounds as if also they are asking for some kind of criteria. You remember when Justice O'Connor was talking from the bench, she said at one point, why can't we just use instructions to the voters as the standard by which we decide which ballots are to be counted? She said those instructions are very clear. Now, what she was asking about, and those instructions were, voters were instructed to punch a hole in the ballot. It may be that they are telling the Florida court to set some sort of standard before they have the recount. But I think the important thing here, Dan, is what you emphasized in the very beginning. Anything other than an outright reversal is a victory of sorts. It's the ability to fight again for Al Gore. It's only an outright reversal would have been a victory really here for George Bush, because that would have meant the vote count would have stopped. From what we can tell so far, there is something in this opinion that is going to let these votes be counted in some way or the other. We're just going to have to wait until we can see this opinion and see what the details are before we can say. But clearly, there is light at the end of the tunnel. There's a crack in the door, whatever metaphor you want to use, apparently, for Al Gore. And we're just going to have to wait, Dan, until we can see more of the details of this opinion.
Well, this, Bob, I think will be important, and we'll turn to Jonathan Turley. But let me pause and say, for those of you who tuned in tonight expecting to see Judging Amy at this hour, as soon as we have finished with this very important, historic Supreme Court decision report, we will pick up with Judging Amy, the program regularly scheduled at this time. So those of you tuned in for that, don't worry, the program's going to be on. Now, Bob Schieffer, what you just said about light at the end of the tunnel, possibly for Al Gore, but it may be that that light at the end of the tunnel is another train coming in his direction, because 7 justices, it's now reported by Associated Press, see constitutional problems with the recount ordered by the Florida court. Now, they see constitutional problems with it, and Jonathan Turley, help me here. As I understand this, we have a 6-3 vote on some parts of the Supreme Court's decision, unsigned opinion. We have 2 different dissents, we're told, and if 7 justices see constitutional problems with recount ordered by the Florida State Court, are they not saying to the Florida State Supreme Court, look, we see some real constitutional problems with this. We're going to send it back to you. And if you can convince us that you are operating within the Constitution and that you have the jurisdiction to get a recount started under Florida law, we're all ears, but you have to show it to us.
That's right. I mean, you can have a remand, which is a great decision for Al Gore because he will live to fight another day, but that doesn't mean that he'll be given a really good opportunity to prevail. They could be sending him back to pull a sword out of a rock, and he might not be able to do that. One of the concerns raised during the argument by the justices was over equal protection. It'll be interesting to see if that was the constitutional flaw. The issue there is a concern that the differing standards in Florida treated voters differently, that it got to the point of the magnitude that it violated the federal Constitution. The U.S. Supreme Court could be telling Florida, we want a uniform standard in here. We want you to stay between the constitutional lines. We're not saying that you can do that. It may not be possible. But if you want to do a recount, here is your burden. And we will have to see whether that's a burden that, frankly, the Florida Supreme Court and Al Gore can carry.
But Jonathan Turley, Saturday, not only did the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 decision, issue the stay that the Bush people wanted and stopped the counting that had been ordered by the state Supreme Court, but Justice Anton Scalia issued something with that stay saying, in effect, this signals that there's high probability that the Bush forces are going to prevail. Now, they haven't prevailed in the sense that, and I don't think we can emphasize this too much, this is a decision in which any way you cut it, the Bush forces must be saying, darn, or something a little stronger than that, because they had hoped the Supreme Court would close out Al Gore. And the Al Gore forces are saying, whew, may not be everything we want, but at least we're still breathing.
Oh, that's absolutely right. It seems clear that these justices did not want to pick a president, that if Al Gore should succumb, he will do so in Florida, not in a chamber of the United States Supreme Court, and not by the hand of 5 conservatives. That's what a remand means, that his future lies and may end in Florida. These justices never could guarantee who the president would be, and they seem to be returning it to Florida to say, it's your game to end. It's your laws that control. But whatever you do, here's the parameters for your conduct.
Now, in terms of Al Gore's chances, he's still breathing, but his chances are in critical care. I want to mix our metaphors here, but has or has not the Supreme Court in effect sent Al Gore back into the contest battle with a big, say, 75-pound sack of sand on his back?
It very well could be that way. That just because they're giving him a remand does not mean that this is a loving or promising decision. It depends on the burden upon which they're placing on the Florida Supreme Court. It may be an impossible burden for that court to shoulder. If they are stressing equal protection and uniform standards, that's not easy. When the Gore attorney was asked by the court, what uniform standard would you suggest? There was this long silence until one of the justices came in and suggested such a standard. It really indicated that this is not an easy question. It's got to be answered. It's got to be answered quickly, and it's got to be doable in the sense that it has to be imposed, votes counted, and this whole thing closed up in a very short order.
Possible danger for Al Gore or not, that the state Supreme Court decision by the Florida Supreme Court, this was a close decision. 1 vote got it started for Gore. This, from all indications, the Supreme Court decision tonight is as complicated as the wiring diagram for some hydroelectric power plant. What's the possibility that the Florida Supreme Court now throws up its hand and says, listen, we've done our best here. We're going to close this thing out?
Well, there's always that chance. You know, the United States Supreme Court cannot tell the Florida Supreme Court what to do with its state law. It can tell the Supreme Court, you've got to stay between certain lines. Then you didn't stay in those lines before. So if you're going to do this thing, if you want to recount votes, here's what you have to do. But it's up to the Florida Supreme Court to do those things, to find a way to work within those parameters. But ultimately, you do have this very close court, one vote difference between the majority and the dissent. What'll be interesting is whether that court says we're in for a penny or a pound. If we're given directions by the U.S. Supreme Court, let's try to see if we can accomplish this in a constitutional way.
And while George Bush did not get nearly what he was hoping for, a closeout of Al Gore, the United States Supreme Court has ruled as of tonight that the Florida State Supreme Court erred in its order to start a manual recount of thousands of ballots in the state contested in the presidential election. What they've said is you erred in ordering that counting and recounting. Now, we're open to you coming up with some suggestion why it is constitutional and why you can start it. We haven't heard it so far. We're going to give you a chance.
That's right. The Florida Supreme Court was clear on what were the ends that they were trying to achieve. But clearly the means they used to achieve it is what caused this reversal and what caused the court to send this back. But it doesn't mean that they can't correct those errors. But they now are going to get clear instructions on what they have to carry to get across that line.
Jonathan Turley, we're going to go to Bob Schieffer in Washington. Once again, I'll remind our viewers that Judging Amy, the program regularly scheduled for this time, will be broadcast. But right now, we're handling what in journalistic terms can only be described as handling hot lead, because the Supreme Court has put out a complicated decision. But for clarity, the United States Supreme Court has reversed the Florida State Supreme Court, has remanded the case back to the Florida Supreme Court without any clear guidelines for a recount. If they're going to be clear guidelines and constitutional ones that will stand scrutiny on appeal, then the Florida State Supreme Court has to come up with that. Let's go to Bob Schieffer. Bob, I know you're plowing through this very, very complicated decision. Give us what context, perspective, and additional facts you can.
Well, Dan, here on page 12 of the majority decision, it says, because it is evident that any recount seeking to meet the December 12th deadline will be unconstitutional for the reasons we have discussed, we reverse the judgment of the Supreme Court ordering a recount to proceed. 7 justices of the court agree that there are constitutional problems with the recount ordered by the Florida Supreme Court that demand a remedy. The only disagreement is to the remedy, because the Florida Supreme Court has said that the Florida legislature intended to obtain the safe harbor benefits of U.S. Code number 5, and then it goes on to say, for its order of a constitutionally proper contest until December 18th contemplates action in violation of the Florida Election Code, and hence could not be part of an appropriate order authorized by the Florida statute. Then they say none are more conscious of the vital limits on judicial authority than the members of this court. None stand more in admiration of the constitutional design to leave the selection of the president to the people through their legislatures and so forth. And then it says the judgment of the Supreme Court of Florida is reversed and the case is then remanded for further proceedings not inconsistent with this opinion. What is not clear in this part of the opinion, and this is as far as I have gotten, is what the remedy is going to be. The justices say they do not believe that any kind of constitutional recount could be conducted by December 12th, that is today, and so they reverse the judgment of the Supreme Court. What was not simply clear to me at this point, Dan, is what is the remedy that they order when they remand this back to the Florida court. We'll just have to continue on reading here before we can figure out where we go from there. But that's it as I see it so far, Dan.
Well, Bob, let me point out to our viewers who see Bob Schieffer dressed as he's not normally, and it's as cold as your average meat locker out there on the outside of the Supreme Court. Just simply note that. I will remind you again that Judging Amy will be shown in its entirety as soon as we finish this CBS News special report. For those of you who are watching in the Eastern and Middle time zones. Justice Souter, and I'm reading here from notes of someone who has read the parts of the opinion, Justice Souter's dissent makes it sound as though the court did not provide guidelines for a recount, and that was his problem with it. Now, the Supreme Court has definitely reversed the Florida State Supreme Court. It has remanded the case back to Florida without any clear guidelines for a recount. Some parts of the Supreme Court decision are by a vote of 6-3, unsigned opinion. 2 different dissents, and this leaves open the possibility, Jonathan Turley, that some parts of it were perhaps of 5-4. We just have to wait until we get the whole thing and are able to go through it. But let's back off of what we call on television the wide shot here. What are the important things that we know?
Well, what we know is that the Supreme Court did not terminate Al Gore's legal chances in the sense that the court is remanding this. That on some level is good news. But the problem is going to be in the details. That is, if the court does not give a clear idea how the Florida Supreme Court can continue, it may not be much of a lifeline for Al Gore. And it's something of a bitter pill that if he gets a remand with a statement that see if you can perfect these problems without any guidelines, it's unlikely that that'll be achieved in the time that Al Gore has left. And so it really looks as if this court did fracture on the details. It is not giving a very clear indication from what we've seen so far at what must be achieved. That type of ambiguity or uncertainty could be lethal to Al Gore. He simply doesn't have the time, and the Florida Supreme Court does not have the unanimity needed to give a clear remedy, other than the one that they've already tried and failed to give Al Gore.
Now, as bits and pieces of this long Supreme Court decision come in, it begins to look, while it's certainly true that Gore doesn't get completely closed out, it begins to look a little darker for him as the deeper you get into the opinion, because in this extraordinary late-night decision, the Supreme Court did rule that the recount ordered by the Florida Supreme Court violated equal rights under the Constitution, and noted that there was not enough time to conduct a new count or recount that would meet the constitutional muster. Now, quote, was quoting the decision, because it is evident that any recount seeking to meet the December 12th date will be unconstitutional, we reverse the judgment of the Supreme Court of Florida, ordering the recount to proceed, and then they remand the case back. Now, the Supreme Court issues 6 opinions in the Bush-Gore case. It may take an army of lawyers to translate this thing between now and tomorrow morning. All of this leaves it unclear how long Al Gore's chances are going to be breathing under these circumstances. On the basis of what we know, what are the chances the Supreme Court has basically said, we think Al Gore is closed out, but we're not going to snuff out his hopes. If that's to be done, the Florida Supreme Court, will have to do it.
That's exactly right, Dan. We talked about this last night, the possibility that the Supreme Court would simply prefer that Al Gore not die by its hand and send this case back to Florida. They can do that by sending this back and eliminating the one remedy that could have brought Florida into the Gore column. If he is effectively barred from a recount, there's not much the Florida Supreme Court can do but to itself terminate any chances of a change that would bring him those electoral votes. And so this may be a real bitter pill for Al Gore in the sense that he could be sent back to Florida for remedies not inconsistent with this opinion, but no such remedies are apparent that could change the outcome.
Well, and we continue to pick up bits and pieces of this. Now, Justice Breyer issued a dissent. In his dissent, he says, quote, no justification for the majority's remedy, that is, the majority of the Supreme Court, which is simply to reverse the lower court and halt the recount, quote, unquote. That's from Justice Breyer's dissent, which clearly says that the majority's remedy is to simply reverse the lower court and halt the recount. We go to Bob Schieffer in Washington. Bob, what else do we know about this very complicated Supreme Court decision?
Well, I think complicated is the understatement of the year, especially for those of us who are laymen. But I'm just coming to that part that you just read in Justice Breyer's dissent, Dan. And clearly what he is saying is that this court has given Gore no remedy. Let me just quote. He says, there is no justification for the majority's remedy, which is simply to reverse the lower court and halt the recount entirely. An appropriate remedy, according to Judge Breyer, would be instead, and I continue to read from his dissenting opinion, to remand this case with instructions that even at this late date would permit the Florida Supreme Court to require recounting all undercounted votes in Florida, including those in Broward, in Volusia, and in Palm Beach and Miami-Dade counties, whether or not previously recounted prior to the end of the protest period, and to do so in accordance with single uniform substandards. In other words, what Justice Breyer is saying here is that the majority has stopped the recount entirely simply on the grounds that there is no more time to do a recount. So that would suggest that that it's over for Al Gore, because if you can't start a recount, then Al Gore has no chance, because all of the counts so far show George Bush in the lead. I say that tentatively because as we continue to read this, we find new details. In the beginning, it sounded as if there was a slight opening for Al Gore. But if you take Justice Breyer's dissent at its word, it appears that there is no recourse now for Al Gore. But we'll keep reading, Dan.
Well, indeed, Bob Schieffer. And for our audience, keep in mind that we got this opinion, we came on the air, told you what the decision was, but the more you read, the more complicated it becomes. Now, Jonathan Turley, our constitutional law expert, for most people, we may as well be speaking Swahili or High Norse here because it's so complicated. But the bottom line is, if we begin to pull it out, the court ruled 7-2 to reverse and remand the Florida Supreme Court's decision. It ruled 5-4 to stop the recounts under one, we don't have a constitutional remedy, and two, time has run out. Does that sound on the money to you?
It does sound like what we had been anticipating, that if the case went back to Florida, it could go back with such a burden that Al Gore simply could not shoulder in time. And here it sounds like the 5-4 split stuck in terms of the remedy, which is the most deadly part for Al Gore. We have to remember that Al Gore's endgame always anticipated the possibility of a set of electors going to Washington selected by the state legislature. But they were prepared for that as long as a separate set of electors, Gore electors, went to Washington as well as certified by the courts. That was a game, frankly, that they could still win. They had challenges set up to try to defeat that second set of electors. But if he can't get a remedy, if he can't get a way to proceed lawfully in Florida to count those votes and select a new set of electors, then it may be over for Al Gore. He will get what's called a Pyrrhic victory. He will go back to Florida still living, only to have the Florida Supreme Court effectively end his future, because there's simply nothing that they can do, because the only thing available may have been shut off by the Supreme Court.
Right. Jonathan, Charlie, we're going to go back to Bob Schieffer. Before doing so, we have more details here. The court issued its ruling in an unsigned opinion, as we said before. Turns out that Chief Justice William Rehnquist, that's the Chief Justice now, and Justices Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas went further in a separate opinion, saying the Florida Supreme Court also violated the United States Constitution and federal law in ordering the recount. So Rehnquist, Scalia, and Thomas come down hard. In a dissent, which means he's in the minority here, Justice John Paul Stevens said, quote, although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner of this year's presidential election, the identity of the loser is perfectly clear. It is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the law, unquote. We go to Bob Schieffer. Bob?
Well, Dan, that is just the passage that I had just come across and was going to read to you. This is a blistering dissent by Judge Stevens. You'll remember he issued a blistering dissent to the stay order that was issued over the weekend. But the language doesn't get much stronger than when you say time will one day heal the wound. To that confidence that will be inflicted by today's decision. Going on to say, although, as you just said, although we may never know with complete certainty the winner of this year's presidential election, the identity of the loser is perfectly clear. Well, if that doesn't throw a cloud over the election, I don't know what could, when you have a justice of the Supreme Court saying we will never know with certainty who won this year's presidential election. That just opens this whole thing up to, is this a legitimate election? Is George Bush really the winner? That's going to give much fuel to all of Al Gore's people, and you're not going to stop hearing that tomorrow. You're going to be hearing that for a long time to come, I would guess.
No doubt, Bob, but we need to pause and say that we pride ourselves on being a nation, a people, a society of laws, not men. And the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of what is the law. And whatever is the consequence of this very complicated and historic decision tonight, one isn't far off out on the limb by saying that whatever it turns out to be, that the American people will recognize that the Supreme Court has worked very hard and tried to come through here with a decision that abides by the Constitution and the law. John Roberts has been covering the Gore campaign. We're having trouble figuring out this opinion. John, what about those on the inside of the Gore camp?
Well, Dan, you folks there in New York aren't the only ones that are having a difficult time. Right now there's conference calls and there's huddles going on and meetings going on here in Washington with the Gore people, down in Tallahassee with his legal team, trying to figure out exactly what this means. Does it mean that they live to fight another day, or is this really the sword through the heart? They're not quite sure at this point, but as you have been talking about with Jonathan Turley tonight, it could be that they're sending it back to the Supreme Court of Florida, where Al Gore got relief a couple of times, and they're going to let them finally bury the hatchet. At this point, Dan, it's not clear. I've been in touch with people who are in the vice president's inner circle, and the word from them is, we just don't know yet. Dan?
John Roberts, Justices Sandra Day O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy did not sign any separate opinion, but their votes were counted in the main unsigned opinion. That's the one in which 7 justices of the Supreme Court said that they were reversing and remanding the case. Dissenting were Justices Stevens, David Souter, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Stephen Breyer. Now, keep in mind, and Jonathan Turley, help me as we go along here, that Al Gore's vice presidential running mate, Senator Lieberman, said Monday that if the Supreme Court, and I believe this is a correct quote, basically overruled the Florida Supreme Court, then that's probably the end of it. It may not be a direct quote, but something along that line. Now, without a recount, which as I understand the Supreme Court decision as we read it here tonight, saying, look, it's a recount might be unconstitutional or is unconstitutional and there's not time to do it anyway. Without a recount, the certification of Bush as the winner of Florida's 25 electoral votes and thus the presidency would stand, would it not?
It would. I mean, the problem for Al Gore's lawyers right now is that they have a remand, so they can, in fact, try to put up a fight, to come up with some other method to remedy this problem. But there was only one known remedy that would bring Al Gore these electoral votes. That's a recount. You have to recount the votes for Al Gore to flip that state. And if the court has effectively shut that off, then this is a very bitter pill. It's along the lines that we've been discussing for the last couple of days, that this court can effectively end his chances without directly doing so.
But if this court, if the Supreme Court has effectively ended his chances without actually doing it inside the marble temple, and I mean that respectfully, that is the Supreme Court, is this or is this not likely to be read as a raw political decision by the Supreme Court?
Well, in fact, it could be read worse than that, because if the 5-4 ruling was just on the remedy, it could be ruled not just as a raw partisan issue, but a somewhat sort of shady way to hide the partisan aspect. That is, if you have 5-4 in terms of the justices cutting off the only remedy that could possibly help Al Gore, while remanding it, it really does sound like you stripped this guy and threw him into a snowbank and you're going to let him succumb to the elements. And that's the type of opinion that is not going to heal the wounds here. It's not going to quiet the charges of partisanship. And what you see in terms of the Stevens dissent is this type of thing that people hoped wouldn't happen. That some members of the court seem to believe that this really was an effort to pick the president without directly pointing at the winner. You just load one of them down so they're certain to lose. That's the type of thing that people were afraid of. But right now, those Gore lawyers are probably trying to think of some way besides recounting the vote that the Florida Supreme Court could use as a remedy. But it's hard to imagine, if they can't recount, how he could possibly bring those votes into his column.
Now, Chief Justice Rehnquist, Scalia, and Thomas, as we understand it, are the very heart of tonight's decision. Bob Schieffer has now pinpointed some of Chief Justice Rehnquist's thoughts in the opinion. Bob?
Well, Dan, the Chief Justice filed a separate opinion, and let me just quote from it. Basically, he agrees with the Bush lawyers about never before have those so-called undervotes been counted. Let me just read this. Quote, the state's attorney general confirmed in oral argument that never before the present election had a manual recount been conducted on the basis of the contention that undervotes should have been examined to determine voter intent. It says for the Florida court to step away from this established practice prescribed by the Secretary of State, the state official charged by the legislature with responsibility to obtain and maintain uniformity in the application, operation, and interpretation of the election laws, was to depart from the legislative scheme. So this again underlines that the justices did not believe it was necessary to have a recount. Now, the other justices in the majority said you couldn't have a recount because there simply wasn't time. But now you have Justice Rehnquist filing a separate appeal, apparently because he wanted to add on to that. And what he felt clearly was that it just didn't fit into the legislative scheme, as he put it, to have a recount. Again, Dan, the mysterious part of this to me is I do not understand what the Supreme Court means for the Florida court to do when they have remanded it back there. It appears the deeper you get into this very complicated decision, the Supreme Court is simply saying it is time to stop counting votes. They do not want the recount started again. But beyond that, I don't understand what they see as the remedy to all of this.
Bob Schieffer. Bill Whitaker's been talking to people in the Bush circle in Austin, as I gather, Bill, that the more they hear about this, the better they like it.
Well, Dan, no official response yet. The initial reaction is silence, both here and here in Austin and down in Tallahassee. In Tallahassee, the attorneys are going through this decision with a fine-tooth comb, trying to figure out exactly what it means for them. As you know, the Bush folks were trying to stop the hand count at all costs. Now, no matter what the Supreme Court decision finally turns out to be, it's not going to stop their fallback option, which is to rely on the Florida legislature to go forward and pick a slate of electors that are loyal to Bush. That is going ahead, and it's going ahead with the blessing of the folks here in Austin. Now, the Supreme Court, or the folks here, thought that the Supreme Court was going to bring an end to the chaos and the questions. It just seems that it may have pushed it on to a different phase. Dan?
Bill Whitaker in Austin. Now, tomorrow's headlines are likely to run along these lines. This is the way Reuters, the international news service, pits the story tonight. A bitterly divided U.S. Supreme Court has ruled for Republican George Bush, halting recounts of ballots in Florida and thus dealing a crushing setback to Democrat Al Gore's hopes of winning the presidency. The nation's highest court voted 7-2 that the Florida Supreme Court ruling ordering the recounts presented, quote, constitutional problems, but then the Supreme Court split by a 5-4 vote on whether new recounts should be ordered to remedy the problem. 5-4 against any new recounts. So with Rehnquist, Scalia, and Thomas at the heart of it, the Supreme Court has reversed and remanded this, but perhaps has done so in such a way that Al Gore's hopes, he's able to go back to Florida, but his hopes have been dealt such a setback that he may never get the counting and recounting of votes that he thought would demonstrate that he had won Florida's 25 electoral votes. And as Bill Whitaker has just pointed out, in the background, the Florida House today voted for the Florida state legislature to select its own set of electors that would deliver the presidency to Bush, whatever. The Florida Senate is scheduled to take up that matter tomorrow. So almost everywhere Al Gore looks now, while the Supreme Court has left his hopes breathing, perhaps slightly, everywhere he looks, Republican-controlled legislature, majority of Republican-appointed justices on the U.S. Supreme Court, a majority of the Republicans in the House of Representatives. Almost everywhere he looks, the high ground is George Bush's. Byron Pitts is in Tallahassee. He's been talking to folks there. Byron?
Well, Dan, as an example that we're all having a hard time getting our arms around this, I got on the phone a little while ago with Dexter Douglas. He's one of Al Gore's lead attorneys here in Florida, and he said, quote, "It's a hell of a mess I don't understand yet." He said he had been on the phone with David Boyce, Gore's lead lawyer, and they were getting a copy of the court ruling faxed to him. You know, Dan, there's a saying in church, be careful what you pray for. The Gore people had said they wanted just the slimmest opportunity to have the votes recounted, a neutral ruling, if you will. Well, it seems tonight that neutral ground is quicksand, but they can't get it done in the time provided. Dexter Douglas also said when I talked to him, it sounds like we can't get it done in time. It's not possible to come up with new guidelines to count all the ballots by December 18th. His last quote was, "It looks like tonight it's almost over for us." Dan?
Byron Pitts in Tallahassee. Jonathan Turley, our constitutional law expert. Now, given this Supreme Court decision, which the Supreme Court has stopped short, perhaps just barely short, of closing Al Gore out, tosses his case back to the Florida Supreme Court, but with such conditions that he may not survive. Give us what may happen with the Florida legislature, and can this be challenged in the Congress of the United States?
See, that's the problem, Dan, in terms of the Bush lawyers and where they go from here. Because the court is so fractured, we don't have a unified or strong majority coming out of the court, speaking with one voice. That's what both sides, frankly, wanted to some extent. Even if it was a remand for Al Gore, he wanted a clear indication that this was going to be left to the Florida Supreme Court to try again. But these 5 conservative justices shut off the one avenue that he may have, and the only one left for him to take Florida. But that doesn't resolve the controversy. For many Democrats and for many other people, they may be unhappy that this is such a fractured court, that they seem to be spread across the board. There is still the possibility that some members of Congress could challenge any electoral votes for President Bush on January 5th when they are read at the joint session of Congress.
This would be one reason the Florida legislature would want to proceed with its own hand-selected set of electors for Bush.
That's right. They
It's
may
sort of an insurance policy against that.
That's right. They may want to have belts and suspenders to have a backup to say, look, if anyone challenges these votes, we want to make it absolutely clear we did a subsequent certification of these electors. These are the electors who speak for Florida.
We're going to go back to Bob Schieffer in Washington, who's been reading this very complicated Supreme Court decision. 7-2, the Supreme Court reverses and remands the case back to the Florida State Court, and by a 5-4 majority says time has run out for recounts, and besides that, at least according to the Chief Justice, they were unconstitutional anyway. Bob Schieffer.
Well, Dan, I would just say reading this is not like sitting by the fire reading a good book. It's really cold out here. You're hearing a lot of horns honking in the background now, whether that is in protest of this decision or in celebration of this decision, I do not know, but the people driving by the Supreme Court, as you can probably hear in the background, are making their wishes known. I'm not sure what kind of finality this brings to this, Dan. I mean, clearly it looks like it's all over for Al Gore at this point. The more we go through this decision, there just doesn't seem to be any place for him to go. But I would go back to this dissent from Justice Stevens in some of the most blistering language that I can ever recall, and I'm afraid it is going to cast a cloud over this election. When you have a justice of the Supreme Court saying, although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner of this year's presidential election, the identity of the loser is clear. It is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the rule of law. I think you're going to hear a lot of Democrats pick up that refrain, and I think you're going to hear it over and over again as we go on down the road. A somewhat confusing decision tonight, and I'm not sure it really brings all that much finality to this. It may mean that George Bush has won the election, but we're going to keep hearing a lot about what happened tonight and what happened in this election, Dan.
Bob Schieffer, we want to underscore the word may. This may mean that George Bush is going to be the next president, but that's by no means clear. And on a historic day, with a historic ruling, the Supreme Court has issued a ruling that is so complex that in some quarters, Jonathan Turley, this is going to be seen as stupefying, not just complicated. You have 6 different opinions, 6 separate opinions from the justices, and according to the wire services, this leaves, quote, legal experts puzzled as to the exact implications, while it appears to give a big boost to Bush. If it leaves legal experts puzzled as to the exact implications, what kind of Supreme Court decision are we dealing with?
You know, that's the problem, is that everyone was hoping for some decision that would resonate, be clear in terms of the ultimate conclusion here. And what we have is a court that seems even more fractured than the country itself, even more fractured than the other 2 branches. That doesn't bring credibility to the result. It doesn't bring legitimacy to any particular victor. What's a little bit disconcerting is that in this opinion, which we're looking at now with some detail, the court talks not about the absence of any remedy. That is, it doesn't order the Florida Supreme Court to terminate this election. It simply says you can't do a recount as one of those remedies. It suggests that there could be other remedies. But in all practical sense, there's no way to resolve the controversy except by counting the votes, and that requires a recount. And that's the one remedy that these justices seem to be closing off. And so it's exactly as you say, Dan, it's the type of ruling that could actually cause more uncertainty, more distrust, that any of the 3 branches are yielding a clear result or speaking with one clear voice.
Well, say again, to italicize it and underscore it, there's never been a people that believed more in the rule of law than the people of the United States. And our history over and over demonstrates that when people understand the law, understand what's been ruled, they swing in behind it whether they like it or not. It occurs to me, check me, when we had the great desegregation, school desegregation decision, 1954, Justice Earl Warren coming, unanimous Supreme Court decision. When we had the question of whether the Richard Nixon tapes, which would decide whether he had to resign or be impeached, that was a unanimous decision, signed by, among others, the Chief Justice Warren Burger. Time after time, on the really critical ones, the Supreme Court has reached unanimity, and that helps even the losers in the case say, well, the Supreme Court has spoken. Can you remember any case in which the Supreme Court has dealt with something anywhere near this importance and they didn't reach unanimity?
You know, Dan, that's exactly right. That is, this is a case that placed the judiciary in one of its greatest tests, a test to try to heal a nation that was desperately looking for resolution as to its ultimate leader. You know, the American people are a different people in terms of how we relate to authority. No one can coerce us or require us to do something. We have to be convinced. And the institution that was to convince us is this one. And so, to a certain extent, this must be a disappointment, even a failure for Chief Justice Rehnquist. Past Chief Justices have tried to bring unanimity, to use their leadership and persuasion. Chief Justice Warren was famous for that, to try to work on his membership, to bring them together, to tell them, we need to speak with certainty so that the American people understand that this is over, not just because of the imposition of our authority, but because of the credibility of the institution. And this is not going to heal any wounds. It's not going to bring any closure in terms of legitimacy. What we have, as you have stated, the authority of the Supreme Court that may effectively end this election. But that's not what the American people were looking for from this court. They were looking for something more basic, something that would resonate with them, where they could go home and say, all right, we have a conclusion, one that we may not accept, but that we can understand. There's little so far in this that most people are likely to understand.
We go to John Roberts, who's covering the Gore campaign. John, any word on what they consider their possible options?
Well, Dan, there's still no official comment yet. The attorneys down there in Tallahassee just got a copy of this decision. They're poring over it now, trying to figure out exactly what to make out of it. But it would appear that if they are remanding back to the Florida Supreme Court, that there will be at least one more stop in court before this is all over. That is, unless, of course, the attorneys were to look through this and decide that there's absolutely nowhere to go, and then they might put into action the plan that they've been thinking about, which would be to concede the election. I don't imagine that would happen tonight. It's getting pretty late here on the East Coast. We might hear something about that tomorrow, if in fact that was the direction that they were going to go in. But Dan, they certainly have made it clear over the last couple of days that if this case were to go broadly against them, that is, that they have no avenue of recourse, they can't start the hand count back up, they can't find the votes that they would need to get past Governor Bush, they would hang it up, they would concede, and they would turn the election over to him. Those two cases from Seminole and Martin County now are going nowhere. So really, unless there's one more stop at the Florida Supreme Court, this may in fact be it, Dan.
May is the operative word. When we came on the air, when we first had word the Supreme Court had indeed decided, and the first bulletin was that it was a 6-3 decision to remand the case back to the Florida Supreme Court. At that time, it appeared that this was, Jonathan Turley, check me if I'm wrong, perhaps a hot potato that the U.S. Supreme Court did not want to handle, so it was sort of tossing it back to the Florida Supreme Court. I don't want to oversimplify this, but we need to have some way for people to understand. Now it takes on more, as we know more about it, sort of the look of a hand grenade, the pin of which has been pulled, and that has been thrown back to the Florida State Supreme Court.
That's right. And we've been talking about this for a few days, that any remand could come with the type of restrictions that Al Gore would still succumb just somewhere else than in front of the Supreme Court. And so we have a situation here where we have the Supreme Court remanding but eliminating a possibility for remedy.
Excuse me, Jonathan Turley. Bulletin from Washington. Democratic National Committee chairman has called on Al Gore to concede the U.S. election. That doesn't mean that Al Gore has conceded, but when the National Committee chairman of his own party calls on Gore to concede, that is, in a word, heavy. We go to Bob Schieffer. Bob, I know you have more about the opinion itself, but let's pause for a second and try to bring this into some context. Beg pardon? You can't top that.
I can't top that.
Well, in Washington terms, as whatever the court decision, so complicated as it is, in practical terms, does that mean that we're likely to hear a concession speech from Al Gore anytime soon?
Well, if what you just said is correct, Dan, that the chairman of the Democratic National Committee has called on Al Gore to concede, I mean, where does he go after that? I mean, that would be a little stronger even than this court decision, I would think. But All I know about it is just what I heard you say there. I would just go back also, Dan. We now have some demonstrators here, kind of the word has gotten around, that are shouting shame on the Supreme Court and so forth. Let me go back to this majority opinion here, and talking about why you can't have a recount. They say, upon due consideration of the difficulties identified, it's obvious the recount cannot be conducted in compliance with the requirements of equal protection and due process without substantial additional work. They also say it would require not only the adoption of adequate statewide standards for determining what is a legal vote and practical procedures to implement them, but also orderly judicial review of any disputed matters that might arise. I mean, I would put the question back for clarification to you and Jonathan Turley there. Would that be what the court is talking about when they are remanding this back to the Florida court for remedy? Or are they saying develop some kind of standards? I just say that as I read this sentence here.
Well, the honest answer for my own part, Bob, is I have no idea. Jonathan Turley's been going through the opinion. From what we know, and we want to keep in mind that we must level with the viewers, there's a lot we don't know. But from what we know, is there any daylight for Al Gore, particularly given that Ed Rendell, the chairman of his own Democratic National Committee, on the basis of this Supreme Court decision, is now calling on him to concede?
Well, you know, Dan, there are always chances for other remedies, but it's simply hard to imagine one that could achieve the result that Al Gore needs besides recounting these votes. This opinion does not say that the Florida Supreme Court can't do something quite creative, but it boggles the imagination to think of any remedy that wouldn't involve the element that this court bars and says that you cannot use. So it basically says you can go back and toil on this all you want, but it takes away all the tools for them to do that. It's an incredibly bitter pill for Al Gore because they were struggling for a remand, to fight another day. Their lawyers are very, very creative. But here, this simply may be a burden that is too great even for Al Gore and these lawyers to shoulder.
Well, Jonathan Turley, I think at this point maybe we want to pause and ask this question. In the heart of this decision, the 5-4 majority that said, look, it's too late for a recount, and besides that, some of us at least think it's unconstitutional. Those five, we know Chief Justice Rehnquist, Scalia, of course, and Thomas, of course, to say of course, because they made their feelings pretty clear before this. The other two of the five would be?
In terms of the conservatives, would be Justice Kennedy and Justice O'Connor.
Now, we're told that Justice O'Connor definitely did not sign anything. Some of these were unsigned opinions of the 6 opinions in it. Now, in a blistering dissent, and I want to quote this because some people maybe join us late, and also we've talked about the majority opinion. In what can only be described as a really blistering dissent, Justice John Paul Stevens called the Bush legal appeal, quote, a federal assault on the laws of the state of Florida. Then he went on to say, and I quote, time will one day heal the wound to that confidence that will be inflicted by today's decision. He's talking about confidence of the court. Continue to quote. One thing, however, is certain. Although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner of this year's presidential election, the identity of the loser is perfectly clear. It is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the rule of law. That's, quote, unquote, the Stevens dissent, which was joined by Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer. Also dissenting was Justice David Souter, but he didn't sign this part of it. Pause. We had a situation in which the lower Florida State Court judge was appointed by a Republican. He was a Democrat, but he had a lot of trouble with the state Supreme Court. A lot of people, after his decision, which virtually closed down Al Gore, said, this is raw politics. Then it went to the state Supreme Court in Florida, all Democratic appointed. They came out with a 5-4 decision in favor of Al Gore, and the other side said this is raw politics. Now we have the Supreme Court decision, and no matter how many times we say the nation needs to pull behind the decision, whatever it is, the prospect of a vision of raw politics dictating what the court did is inevitable. Why would the court do it this way?
I can't imagine they wanted to do it this way. They succeeded in avoiding a 5-4 split in terms of the remand. That must have been some accomplishment, but in the end, they could not get, in terms of the critical component, that type of strong majority. They divided as people expected. They seemed to rush to fulfill the stereotypes that pundits had left over the weekend. And what's tragic is that it's often in our history the courts that have brought us together when we have been most divided. That we fall into natural divisions because of politics or economics or race or religion, but it's the courts often that have brought us together because we share a common touchstone of the law. And when the courts have called us to that touchstone, they sometimes have healed our wounds. It didn't mean that we agreed with them or agreed with each other, but we accepted the result. This has to be a failure for the court as an institution, because to many people this is a picture of justices behaving badly, not doing better than we were doing. And we sort of expect somehow, maybe this was naive, that at the end of the day we would hear a unified voice that spoke to us not from partisan divisions, but spoke to us from some central concept of the law. And so, unfortunately, we are left tomorrow morning, I expect, with a choice that's made de facto. Al Gore may not be able to shoulder this burden. And as Justice Stevens said, many people in the country will look at this as not selecting a winner, but burdening a candidate so much that he is most certainly a loser.
Has there been any time in our history where a United States Supreme Court has come anywhere close to deciding who was going to be the president?
No. This is historic. You have one branch that may effectively dictate the head of the executive branch, or the judiciary would effectively dictate who the head of the executive branch would be. And what people have to remember, I think, because there'll be a lot of heat rather than light in the next few hours and tomorrow, is that there were good faith arguments on both sides. That's why you're seeing this fractured court. While we expected more from them than perhaps we could have produced ourselves, that may have been something that was a bit naive. But they have to remember that these were difficult questions. They were close questions, and they ultimately divided this court. But ultimately, we have to accept that we have a system that yields a certain result. And we have to come together as Americans and say the process ran to its conclusion. Maybe not to our satisfaction, but it may have run to its conclusion.
Keeping in mind that right now the conclusion includes 6 separate opinions running 65 pages, separate dissents by each of the court's 4, we can call it in the core decision, 4 losing members of the Supreme Court, including that scathing denunciation by Justice Stevens. We go quickly to John Roberts. John, the Democrats have begun calling for Al Gore's concession. Has he heard that call?
Dan, they've definitely heard the calls both from Ed Rendell, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and as well from Lawrence Tribe, the constitutional law professor from Harvard, who argued the first case before the Supreme Court, saying that the gentlemanly thing would be for Al Gore to concede this election now in the wake of this decision. Certainly Joe Lieberman was on the record yesterday with a Hartford radio station as saying if the Supreme Court rules against the vice president, he should concede the election. And in recent days, even his closest advisors have been saying, if we lose at the Supreme Court, that's it, we're going to concede the election. They're all talking to each other right now. They're trying to figure out exactly what this ruling means. Does it leave them any wiggle room whatsoever to try to get one last remedy from the Supreme Court of Florida, or do they have to face the music, Dan, that this may be over? I've gotten calls in to the assistance of all of these people. They're engaged in these phone calls right now. At this point, they're saying nothing, but they said that they probably would have something to say by night's end. Dan?
John Roberts, Dateline Austin. If not the governor himself, Bush aides are beginning to celebrate. A Bush aide is quoted as saying that the initial reading of the Supreme Court ruling seems to be a victory for Bush. It may or may not be completely over for Vice President Al Gore. His hopes of coming from behind, getting votes he said were never counted in Florida. It does not look at the moment that there's very much hope. What the Supreme Court has done is delivered a severe blow, perhaps an absolutely crushing blow, and kicked it back to the Florida State Supreme Court. That's where things stand at the moment. Now keep in mind that your late local news will will be coming on in many places right behind this and have more about this. A programming note, we had planned to return viewers in the Eastern and Central time zones to Judging Amy. That turned out not to be possible because of the importance and complexity of tonight's absolutely stunning, if not stupefying, Supreme Court decision. We've stayed on with our special CBS News coverage. We hope you understand. Tonight's episode of Judging Amy will be seen in its entirety at a later date. There will be much more about the presidential election and tonight's Supreme Court decision on your late local news, and for those of you in the West, on tonight's edition of 60 Minutes too. With a reminder that we are a nation of laws, a reminder of where the Supreme Court stands in our country and our society. Dan Rather, CBS News in New York.
For news 24 hours a day, CBS.com on the internet and on our interactive partner, America Online, at keyword CBS News. This is CBS.
Worried about price this holiday season? Well, that's because you're in the right place. H.H. Gregg will double the difference if anybody beats our price. Simply, if you buy from us, then find the same item for less somewhere else, we'll double the difference.